You've all heard the stories, haven't you? The ones about the things that might be lurking down in the sewers, theories about what could possibly exist in the darkness beneath our feet, thriving in the filth we flush away. What kind of creatures could survive on the endless supply of waste, absorbing the chemicals, feeding on the discarded scraps, adapting, mutating, changing into something else entirely? And if those things were capable of feeding on trash, what would stop them from eventually feeding on us? I never finished high school. Let's just get that out of the way now. I left at 16, not because I hated school, but because life had forced my hand. After my dad passed away, there were bills to pay, and my 3 younger siblings needed food on the table. I figured knowing how to solve for X or recite lines from Shakespeare wasn't as important as making sure my family had something to eat. So, I left school behind and started working whatever jobs I could get. The next 4 years were a series of back-to-back dead-end jobs. I did everything from flipping burgers at fast food joints to stocking shelves in retail stores and doing back-breaking labor under the sun. None of it paid well, and none of it felt like it would get me anywhere. But then a friend mentioned something that caught my attention. City maintenance was hiring. It didn't sound glamorous, but it was steady work, and the pay was better than what I was making. I figured I had a decent shot. My dad had been a maintenance worker for the county since before I was born, and I'd grown up watching him fix things. He'd taught me a lot over the years: plumbing, construction, basic electrical work, even how to keep a vehicle running when it felt like it was on its last breath. I knew my way around tools, and I was confident I could handle the job. But there was a problem, a big one. The job required applicants to have either a high school diploma or a GED, and I had neither. Still, I figured I had nothing to lose by making a call. Maybe I'd get lucky. That's when I got Mr. Decker on the line. Now, Mr. Decker wasn't just some random city employee. He had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. He and my dad had started working for the city at the same time, and over the years, they became close. Mr. Decker eventually got promoted, but my dad never minded working under him. He always said that Mr. Decker was a great leader, and he was proud to be his right-hand man. When my dad passed, Mr. Decker was one of the few people who stepped up without hesitation. He made sure we had groceries when money was tight, and he was always there if we needed anything. Hearing his voice on the other end of the phone felt like a small stroke of luck. As soon as I explained my situation, he didn't hesitate. He told me to go ahead and apply anyway, said he'd see what he could do. A week later, I got a call. Mr. Decker wanted me to come in for an interview. I showed up at his office, nervous but hopeful. As I sat down across from him, he leaned back in his chair, looking at me with a familiar expression. "This is just a formality," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I already know what you're capable of. Honestly, you're one of the strongest candidates I've got. If it were up to me, I'd hire you on the spot." He paused for a moment, his expression shifting. "But there's one issue holding me back: the GED. I nodded, already preparing myself for the rejection. It wasn't like I hadn't expected it. As I pushed back my chair and started to stand, I opened my mouth to thank him for his time, but before I could, he lifted a hand to stop me. "Sit down. I'm not finished," he said. I hesitated, then slowly lowered myself back into the chair. "I talked to my boss about your situation," he continued. And he talked to his boss. We went up the chain, and we came to a decision. I held my breath. "You'll get the job, but on one condition," he said. "For the next 6 months, you'll be on probation. In that time, you need to get your GED. If you can do that, the position is yours permanently." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Does that sound fair?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief settle over me. It was a fair deal, more than fair, really. As I shook his hand, he smiled and told me he was happy to have me on board. That moment felt like a turning point. The job was exactly what I needed. I was still living at home with Mom, and my younger siblings weren't old enough to work yet. The steady paycheck from the city meant we could finally start clawing our way out of the debt that had been hanging over us like a storm cloud for months. Mom nearly broke down in tears when I told her I'd be using the money to help out more around the house. She'd been carrying too much on her shoulders, and I could see the weight start to lift the moment I told her. I wasted no time figuring out how to take my GED as soon as possible. There were online study guides, practice tests, and all kinds of resources I didn't even know existed. But diving into those materials made me realize just how much I had missed out on by leaving school early. There were massive gaps in my knowledge, things that seemed basic to other people but were foreign to me. I knew I had to put in the work to catch up. At the same time, I couldn't slack off at my new job either. I eventually found a rhythm, working during the day, coming home, eating dinner, and then hitting the books until exhaustion won out. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The job itself, I quickly realized, was something I was naturally good at. I wasn't just getting by, I was excelling. I had been paired up with one of my dad's old friends, a guy named Nolan, who had been with the city for decades. I had been hired to eventually take over his position in 6 months if I managed to pass my GED. Nolan was counting down the days until retirement, but he reassured me he had no doubt I'd pass. "You're your father's son," he told me more than once. "You've got it in you." But there was something Mr. Decker hadn't mentioned during the hiring process. Nolan's position wasn't just any maintenance job. He was responsible for the city's sewer system, or, as he liked to call it, the understench. "It's like stepping into another world down there, kid," Nolan had said on my first day. "You gotta be careful, but I think you'll do just fine. Just follow the rules and you'll make it out in one piece." Nolan had a strict set of rules for working in the understench, and he wasn't the type to tolerate anyone ignoring them. Rule number 1 was simple enough: always wear your industrial boots. "There's things down there you don't want to step in, trust me," he said with a shake of his head. "The state gives you boots for a reason. Use them." Rule number 2, never go in without a light. "I don't care if you forget your whole damn tool belt in the truck," Nolan told me firmly. "If you're in the understench, you better have a light on you. These tunnels are old, kid. Some of them date back to the early 1900s. The deeper you go, the darker it gets. And believe me, you don't want to be down there in the dark." He tapped the headlamp strapped to his forehead before flipping it on, momentarily blinding me. "I recommend you get one of these," he said, smirking at my reaction. "But anything will do. A flashlight, a lantern, hell, even a Bic lighter if you're desperate. Just don't go in without a light. You hear me?" That was where the rules started to get a little strange. Rule number 3, always listen for the scraping. It was around the 3rd day into my first week on the job. Nolan and I were deep in the sewers, conducting routine checks on the walls to ensure they weren't under too much strain. But before I go into that, I should probably explain something about the sewer system in our town. It's a bizarre mix of ancient brickwork and modern concrete. Some sections are spacious enough for a tall person to walk through comfortably, while others are so tight that Nolan and I had to practically crawl to navigate them. Over the years, newer sewer lines were built directly on top of the old ones, and in some areas, the older tunnels had started collapsing, pulling parts of the newer system down with them. Our job was to check for early signs of these structural failures. Nolan had an efficient system in place, ensuring he inspected every section of the sewers on a rotating 2-week schedule. That day, we were making our way through one of the oldest sections, crouching low as our headlamps swept across the damp, uneven surfaces. We were looking for any fractures or softened areas in the walls, but what caught my eye instead were strange marks on the concrete. At first glance, they looked like deep scratches, thin, jagged lines running along the surface, as if something had scraped across it. And the more I looked, the more they resembled fingernail marks, like someone, or something, had dragged its nails through the concrete itself. I pointed them out to Nolan, asking if he knew what had caused them. His response was short and unsettling. "We'll talk about it once we're topside." I could tell he wasn't just brushing me off. There was something about his tone, something serious. I wanted to press him for answers right then and there, but before I could get a word out, he suddenly raised a hand to silence me. That was when I heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping sound echoed through the tunnel ahead of us. It was unmistakable, the exact same noise you'd expect if someone were running their nails across rough concrete. It wasn't coming from behind us, which would have been eerie enough. It was coming from up ahead. "This way," Nolan murmured, barely above a whisper. Without hesitation, he turned and led me down a different passage, moving quickly but not running. I followed, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. And maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was the acoustics of the tunnels playing tricks on me. But as we moved away, I could have sworn the scraping sound started moving faster, as if it was following us. Minutes later, we emerged above ground through a manhole near the old theater on 4th and Lex. The moment Nolan got the cover back in place, he dusted off his hands and said, "We'll grab some lunch, then come back later. It should be gone by then." I frowned, still rattled by what had just happened. "What should be gone?" I asked, watching as he headed toward a small bistro nearby. Nolan shrugged, not breaking his stride. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never seen it. The guy before me never saw it either. But he told me the scraping is something you don't mess with, so I never have." He took a seat at an outdoor table, stretching his legs. "It leaves behind those marks, though, the ones you saw. And my old mentor used to say that whatever it is, it has a weird habit of making the tunnels a little cleaner than before." From that moment on, I made sure to always stay alert for the scraping sound. No matter how focused I was on the job, I never let my guard down when I was in the tunnels. Even so, as the weeks passed, I found myself settling into the routine of working in the dark, damp passages beneath the city. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it became familiar. The smell, though? That was something you never really got used to. You just learned to tolerate it. I invested in a good respirator, which I wore every time I went down there, picked up several pairs of water-resistant jumpsuits, and upgraded to sturdier boots that could handle the grime and moisture. By the time I had been on the job for a full month, Nolan admitted that he was impressed with how quickly I was adapting. But despite my progress, I still hadn't learned all of the rules that kept us safe down there. There were things Nolan hadn't told me yet, things I hadn't encountered. Like Rule 4, which I would soon find out was one of the most important rules of all. That day, we were making our way through the tunnels as usual, inspecting the walls and searching for any signs of damage. I was following Nolan closely when, without warning, his arm shot out, stopping me in my tracks. Just as I was about to question him, I saw what he had stopped me from stepping into. Right there in front of me, my headlamp barely catching the edge of it, was a hole in the ground. But it wasn't just any hole, it was filled with something. A thick, sludgy substance that almost seemed to be shifting on its own. The more I stared, the more unnatural it seemed. It was pitch black, darker than anything I had ever seen, almost as if it was swallowing the light from my lamp rather than reflecting it. And then I noticed something even more unsettling. It was moving, pulsing, wriggling ever so slightly like a living thing. And before I knew it, my fingers had begun to twitch. There was this sudden, almost overwhelming urge to reach out and touch it, and without thinking, my hand started to move forward. "I know," Nolan said, his voice calm but firm, his arm still pressed against my chest. "But don't. Just don't. It pulls you in, and no one knows what happens after that. Best not to find out." He didn't have to tell me twice. I forced myself to look away and stepped carefully around the pit, making sure not to glance back. As we moved on, I realized just how many of them there were. Dark, writhing pools of sludge lurking in the depths of the tunnels. The further we went, the more unnerving it became. I couldn't help but ask Nolan about them, hoping for some kind of explanation. But all he said was that they had always been there for as long as he could remember. His old mentor, he told me, had been unlucky enough to get too close to one. One slip, one moment of bad luck, and he had lost his hand. His hand just went right in, Nolan said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. And if I hadn't grabbed him in time, he probably would have lost a lot more than that. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting at the thought. "It took his whole hand?" I asked, half expecting him to be exaggerating. "Yep, clean off, right at the wrist, like it had never even been there." The way he said it made my skin crawl. He went on, explaining that the old man had tried to report it, claimed that something in the water had grabbed him. But Nolan figured the higher-ups already knew the truth. The old man retired not long after, and Nolan, having witnessed it firsthand, had been extra careful ever since. And after that night, so was I. That was rule number 4, stay away from the black puddles. Nolan didn't have many rules, just 5, but the last one was the one he took the most seriously. According to him, we never climbed down into holes that led into the old sewer systems, and we never ventured more than 2 levels below street level. It was a simple rule, but one he never wavered on. About halfway through my second month, we came across something unusual, something that pushed right up against the boundary of that 5th rule. A massive hole that plunged much deeper than anything I'd seen before. It wasn't just deep, it twisted downward, spiraling into the earth like a tunnel carved by something that didn't want to be found. I'd never encountered anything like it. Without thinking too much about it, I started rigging up a rope, ready to rappel down and take a closer look. But before I could get any further, Nolan shook his head, already reaching for his radio. He didn't say much, just called in a request for a mixer truck, the kind used for major repairs. He took one last look down into the darkness, then told them to bring a double load. "No matter how deep it goes, we're sealing it up," he muttered as he clipped his radio back onto his belt. I nodded, still glancing down at the hole, but Nolan wasn't finished making his point. "We don't go into those holes. Not the ones leading into the old tunnels. There's things down there you don't want to meet. And if you get lost in that section, you might never find the light again." I didn't question him after that. When the truck arrived, we wasted no time hauling the heavy fill hose through the tunnels, snaking it along the damp ground until we reached the pit. The nozzle dangled over the edge, and the moment we flipped the switch, thick concrete started pouring down into the depths. It took longer than expected. Way longer. The hole was far deeper than I had assumed, swallowing up batch after batch of cement without ever giving the impression that it was filling up. But eventually, after what felt like forever, the surface finally evened out. We gave the hose a few tugs, signaling the team above to reel it back up. Then, we marked off the area with cones, leaving it to set. With that done, we moved on. Our shift was only halfway over, and there was still work to do. But something had changed. I understood Nolan's rule in a way I hadn't before. No matter how tempting it was to see what was below, I wasn't going to be the one climbing into those depths. But Nolan's lessons didn't last much longer. One morning, I arrived at work only to be called straight into Mr. Decker's office. It caught me off guard. I had only been on the job for 3 months, and my first thought was that I had messed something up. My probation period was almost over, and I was scheduled to take my GED exam at the end of the month. I was confident I'd pass, maybe even get off probation early. But if I had screwed up, I could probably kiss that goodbye. Mr. Decker didn't look mad, though. He looked troubled. I asked him what I had done wrong, but he shook his head. "It's not you," he said. "It's Nolan." Something about his tone made my stomach drop. "Nolan's sick, kid, and I don't mean regular sick. He's got some kind of severe pneumonia, and he's probably going to be out for a few weeks." I was at a loss for words, concerned that this might mean Nolan would have to retire earlier than expected. But Mr. Decker reassured me that wouldn't be the case. Nolan would be back soon. Nolan's had issues with his lungs on and off ever since he hit 45. "It's just something he's had to learn to manage," Mr. Decker explained. "But the doctors have him on 2 weeks of bed rest, along with a strong round of steroids. So, the question is, do you think you can handle Nolan's job while he's out?" I took a moment to think it over. I didn't want to take on more than I could handle. But then I thought about Nolan's rules. He always said that as long as I stuck to them, I'd be fine. So after a brief hesitation, I nodded. I believed I could do it. Mr. Decker seemed pleased with my answer. He went on to tell me that once I passed my GED test, I'd officially become Nolan's apprentice until the day he retired. And after that, I'd be the one in charge of sewer repairs for the entire department. That idea thrilled me. It meant I'd be in a leadership position, possibly with a raise and better benefits. It gave me something to look forward to. I started my shift that day feeling hopeful. For the first few days, things went smoothly. It was just another week on the job. I heard that scraping sound every now and then, but I didn't see any of the black sludge, and I didn't come across any deep holes. I made sure to keep my flashlight on me at all times, and I always wore the right boots whenever I stepped into the understench. I was careful, fully aware that I was down here alone now. But for a while, everything was fine. Then came Friday, Day 5 of being the only one under the city. That's when I got a call about a potential clog in one of the lines. I sighed, knowing my lucky streak couldn't last forever. Unclogging blockages is my least favorite part of the job. Depending on how bad it is, clearing it out could take hours. And the whole time, you're stuck standing next to a rotting, foul-smelling mass of waste, grease, and trash. I grabbed the long pole we kept in the truck for situations like this. We called it the harpoon. Turned out, the clog was just a bunch of storm debris, likely washed into the sewers from the downpour the night before. It wasn't unusual. You never knew what kind of junk the rain might carry down here. But as I positioned myself with the harpoon, I felt something unsettling beneath my feet. The ground let out a deep, groaning creak. My stomach dropped. I tested my footing, making sure the floor wouldn't give way under me. Like I said, sinkholes weren't exactly rare in these old sewers. I stomped my boots a few times, waiting to see if anything crumbled. When nothing happened, I decided it was safe enough and turned my attention back to clearing the blockage. It looked like an old tarp had gotten tangled in something. The job was frustrating. Every time I loosened one part of the clog, it would snag on the shred remains of the tarp. Sweat clung to me, my work shirt damp and sticking to my back. And then, as I kept at it, I noticed the ground shifting beneath me again. I thought about stepping back, but before I could, part of the tarp tore free and drifted further down the tunnel. I jabbed at it with the sharp end of the harpoon. As I hacked away at it, the blockage finally started breaking apart. I grinned, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It broke apart, the fragments drifting away in the sluggish current. And then, before I even registered what was happening, my left foot plunged through empty space. A sickening moment of weightlessness followed. My stomach lurched as I dropped, my arms flailing for something, anything, to grab onto. But there was nothing. My descent ended with a brutal impact, my head colliding with the unyielding concrete floor. The world around me blinked out in an instant. When consciousness returned, it did so in absolute, suffocating darkness. No light, no shadows, just an all-consuming blackness pressing in on every side. My breathing came in short, uneven gasps as I tried to orient myself. The hole I'd fallen through had to be somewhere above me, but no matter how I craned my neck or strained my eyes, I couldn't pinpoint where. A cold dread settled over me as I fumbled through my pockets, blindly searching for my flashlight. And that was when I heard it, a skittering sound, nails scraping against concrete. It was close, too close. The noise had haunted me ever since I started this job, but I had never been this near to it. My pulse pounded against my skull. My fingers finally closed around the flashlight, but they were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped it. My breath hitched as I fumbled with the switch, desperate for light, desperate to see whatever was making that god-awful sound before it got any nearer. When the beam finally flickered to life, my stomach twisted into knots. The chamber I had landed in wasn't part of the sewer system. The walls surrounding me weren't concrete. They were packed earth, raw and uneven, as if something had burrowed through. I swept the light upward, searching for the opening I had fallen from, but all I found was a narrow chute leading back into darkness. There was no way I'd be climbing out that way. I was trapped. Nolan's warning about avoiding unknown holes suddenly made perfect sense. With a rising sense of panic, I reached for my phone, hoping against hope for a signal. Even if it was weak, I could send out a distress message, call for help, anything. But when I pulled it from my pocket, my heart sank. The screen was shattered, the casing cracked nearly in half. Useless. I shoved it back, swallowing hard against the creeping feeling of hopelessness. My only option was forward. The beam of my flashlight landed on a single tunnel, stretching deeper into the earth. It was narrow, just barely big enough for someone my size to fit through. I hesitated, but I had no choice. I had to move. The passage was about 7 feet high, but its width forced me to twist and press my body against the dirt walls in places just to squeeze through. As I pushed forward, an unsettling thought took root in my mind. These tunnels weren't natural. Something had made them. And then I saw them. Long, jagged scratches lining the walls. Deep grooves where something with claws had scraped its way through. My mouth went dry. The same scratching sound echoed around me, distant but unmistakable, carried through the tunnels by unseen currents of air. I had been hearing it since I started working down here, and now I was inside whatever had made it. A cold sweat slicked my skin as I pressed forward, the tight space making it impossible to move quickly. The farther I went, the more my nerves stretched thin. My flashlight was my only lifeline, its glow the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. It should have had a full charge, 12 hours of battery life, and I had only used it briefly the day before. But I had never felt so paranoid about it failing on me. I wished I had brought my headlamp. The scratching sound was constant now, shifting in direction, making it impossible to pinpoint. At times, it seemed to come from far behind me. Other times, it was just ahead, beyond the reach of my light. And once, just once, I swore it came from inside the wall, right next to my ear. I clenched my jaw, telling myself it was just the acoustics of the tunnel, the way sound bounced in these tight spaces. It had to be. I forced my breathing to slow, taking shallow, controlled inhales. The tunnel walls pressed tighter around my chest, making deep breaths impossible. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving. Slowly, I edged forward, forcing myself to tune out the relentless scratching that echoed through the tunnels. Every nerve in my body was on edge, but I pressed on until the passage suddenly gave way beneath me, sending me stumbling into a larger chamber. I hit the ground hard, scrambling to my feet just in time to take in what lay ahead, a three-way split in the underground paths. One tunnel veered to the left, another to the right, and the third stretched forward into the darkness. I held my breath, listening carefully, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The scratching was still there, steady and deliberate, coming from somewhere in front of me. I hesitated only for a moment before choosing the middle tunnel. But just as I shifted my weight forward to take that first step, a second noise stopped me cold. It came from the left tunnel, louder, quicker, more urgent than the first. My heart pounded as I pressed myself back against the dirt wall, tightening my grip on the harpoon in my hands. I wasn't sure what I was about to see, but if I was going to survive, I needed to know what I was up against. With my body hunched low, I stole a glance into the adjoining tunnel, and what I saw nearly made me drop my weapon. A grotesque figure was pulling itself through the burrow. It was impossibly tall and unnaturally long, its frame almost too large to squeeze through the space. Its body was covered in wrinkled, sagging flesh, a sickly pale shade that reminded me of something lifeless and rotten. It dragged itself forward on multiple elongated arms, each ending in jagged, yellowed nails that scraped against the walls with every movement. Its mouth, a massive, gaping hole filled with uneven, grime-coated teeth, remained open in a permanent, grotesque expression, like a sea creature perpetually gasping for air. But it wasn't just the way it looked that turned my stomach. It was the way it moved. Its entire body seemed to collapse inward as it squeezed through the tight space, deflating like a fleshy balloon before stretching out again on the other side. Its skin rippled and shifted as if its bones weren't fixed in place, as if it could rearrange its very structure at will. It was slow, agonizingly so, taking minutes just to slither through the tunnel. Along its sides, additional smaller limbs wriggled, helping it claw its way forward. They, too, were tipped with cracked, dirt-caked nails. Then, just as the creature reached the center of the crossroads, it hesitated. It remained still for only a moment, but in that time, something dark and viscous pooled beneath it. A thick, black substance seeped from its body, slowly forming a puddle on the dirt floor. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen that before. It was the same unsettling liquid we had been finding in the sewers, the same strange substance that had made Nolan's voice tremble when he spoke about it. As soon as the creature dragged itself out of sight, I crept forward, my flashlight illuminating the black puddle. It was spreading, creeping outward, devouring the dirt as it expanded. The way it moved, the way it almost pulsed, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a liquid, it was something else entirely. My mind flashed back to Nolan's story, the way he described a man's hand being consumed, swallowed whole by the very same substance. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I ducked into the tunnel I had originally intended to take, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't get the image of that thing out of my mind. The way it looked, the way it moved, the sound of its nails dragging against the walls. As I ventured deeper, the scratching sounds continued, echoing through the tunnels all around me. farther I went, the more burrows I found. More of those unsettling underground chambers, more crossroads where I had to decide which path to take. But worst of all, I kept finding those black puddles. They were everywhere. Some were small enough to step over, but others stretched across the entire width of the tunnels, forcing me dangerously close just to get past. And as insane as it sounded, the more I watched them, the more convinced I became that they were alive. Carefully stepping forward, I rounded a corner, only to feel my footing slip slightly. Instinctively, I reached out to steady myself against the wall, only to grasp at empty air. My pulse spiked as I quickly jammed my harpoon down against the ground, praying it would hold. It did. And as I steadied myself and looked down, I realized what I had nearly fallen into. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a sheer drop that would have meant certain death. Below me stretched a massive cavern, dimly illuminated by clusters of eerie, bioluminescent mushrooms clinging to the damp rock. Their faint glow cast sickly shadows over the writhing shapes that filled the space beneath me. I stiffened. The creature I had encountered earlier, already nightmare-inducing on its own, was nothing compared to these. Down there, they were enormous. Some towered at 12 feet, others 16, and a few looked even bigger than that. Their grotesque forms twisted and undulated as they moved, their jagged claws sometimes raking against one another, tearing flesh with wet, ripping sounds. I watched, stomach twisting, as chunks of their own bodies were effortlessly stripped away, though none of them seemed to react. I started counting them. 10, 20, more than 50. My throat was dry by the time I gave up trying to keep track. Forcing myself to move, I pressed onward, carefully navigating the tunnel and clinging tightly to the small lifeline of my flashlight. Each step felt like a gamble, but when I finally spotted a narrow passageway sloping upward, relief surged through me. I let out a small, triumphant noise, thrusting my fist into the air. This had to be one of the burrows they used to access the sewers. If I followed it up, I could get out. The deeper I went, the more the tunnel's texture changed. The slimy, soft mud beneath my boots gradually became drier, more compact. Soon, the walls stopped feeling like raw earth and became something else. Rough, uneven bricks. When I saw them lining the tunnel, I let out a shaky breath. It was familiar. It was man-made. I was close. And when I finally emerged into the sewers and spotted a ladder leading up to the surface, I nearly collapsed in exhausted relief. The moment I climbed up and felt the sun's warmth against my face, I closed my eyes and soaked it in. I had made it. I was 12 blocks away from the county office. By the time I stumbled inside, disheveled and dirt-streaked, Mr. Decker's secretary let out a startled gasp at the sight of me. Her eyes went wide. She told me that Mr. Decker had sent a team down into the sewers to search for me hours ago after failing to reach me by phone. They had feared the worst. Wordlessly, I pulled out the remains of my phone, the broken device barely recognizable. I gave her a brief, shaky explanation of what had happened. Without wasting a moment, she immediately called Mr. Decker, who sounded immensely relieved to hear that I had resurfaced. Not long after, he and the team of men he had sent to look for me emerged from the sewers as well, expressions filled with a mixture of concern and exasperation. He offered to take me to the hospital just in case I needed medical attention. I assured him I wasn't seriously hurt, but I still wanted to go. Not for myself, though. I wanted to check on Nolan. He had been admitted to the short-stay wing a few days earlier after running a high fever, and I needed to see him. Mr. Decker gave a knowing nod and gestured for me to follow him to his car. "You might want to get cleaned up first," he remarked, eyeing my dirt-covered state with an amused but sympathetic look. "You're a mess, son." Before long, I was sitting in a stiff hospital chair beside Nolan's bed, recounting everything to both him and Mr. Decker. The words tumbled out of me. Everything I had seen, everything I had barely escaped. When I finished, Mr. Decker turned toward Nolan, searching his expression. The old man, however, merely shrugged. "If the kid says that's what he saw, then I believe him," Nolan said, his voice steady. "He's got no reason to make up something like that. And honestly, that explains a hell of a lot about what's been going on down there." His gaze met mine, and despite everything, the corners of his mouth lifted in a smirk. "Guess in this case, we can forgive that rule about not climbing into holes too deep to see the bottom of." He winked. Nolan was discharged a little over a week later. I was glad to have him back. 2.5 weeks of working alone in the sewers had left me itching for company again. A few weeks after that, I walked into work holding the results of my GED test, finally, officially, a high school graduate. That night, the guys took me out to celebrate, treating me to pizza and beer. Somewhere in the middle of the evening, Nolan clapped me on the back, grinning. "Proud of you, kid," he said. "Would have been a real pain to break in another new guy." He laughed, and I found myself laughing too. So, yeah, I kept the job. I still go down into the sewers, and the money is too good to walk away from. But now, I'm careful. More careful than I ever was before. I watch my footing, I avoid soft spots, and most importantly, I never ever forget the rules Nolan drilled into my head. I haven't seen another one of those creatures since that day in the deep tunnels, and I pray to God I never do again.